I find that what winds up happening is you can go down this path of like agreeing with neoliberals, with the sort of neoliberal consensus that things go wrong because of people's uncontrolled desires. And things go wrong because of something wrong with us. And I think you don't need that. One, you don't need that to explain crisis. And two, when you use that to explain crisis, you go outside of the capitalist system and you say it's something in humans. Well, if it's something in humans, then there's no point in trying to overcome it because it'll just be reproduced again. If it's something within the capitalist system, and the way that we are is a product of that, then it can be changed. Or if it's something that is internal to the capitalist system, it is going to reproduce itself so long as we have capitalism. And I mean like crisis and that sort of thing. Sorry, Ben, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I was just wondering if those issues have to go together, right? In other words, like, on the face of it, it seems like you could have some, fixed human nature, which, would be very unsurprising for, biological beings who, have brains that have evolved in certain ways and all that stuff. But for that also not to explain much historically, right? In other words, like, okay, sure, let's say that like humans are a certain way, which I mean, I don't know. I'm not even sure your dog would disagree, all that stuff about species being, right? But like there's a certain way that humans are, but like also that's not going to explain very much about why a particular thing happens at a particular time in history, because humans have existed throughout the whole thing, and like, different things happen at different times, and there are crises or they're not, so how much of it could, like you might think that it's like, yeah, there are certain like baseline facts about how people are, and we're not going to be that different, under a different society, but also that like specific historical events happening at specific times can't really, like, that's not going to do much heavy lifting in explaining why any of that stuff happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent it does, in the sense that like at a certain point nature stopped changing us and we started changing nature. I can hear John Bunch's voice in my head. We don't change nature. But yeah, that's the only reason why human beings still exist today. What's that?
Of course we change nature.
I'm sure he means something very particular by that, but that's the only reason why human beings still exist today. I say this all the time, but like in many ways, as in our physical bodies, we are less adapted to nature than other animals. But what has characterized human evolution is this, like, look how this cranial vaulting that we've got here. If you look at an ape, they don't have that. That's been the characteristic change over time, is our brains. We have changed, we change nature, and in so doing, we change ourselves. And this has been the sort of characteristic thing. There's a famous line in the German ideology where Marx says humans can be differentiated from animals in any way you wish, but they themselves differentiate themselves when they begin to make their own means of subsistence, when they begin to act on the world and modify the world. And when you make your own mode of production, or you make your own means of subsistence, when you act upon the world in order to sustain yourself, you do something very, very different than animals do. And people say, oh, is that transhistorical? Yes, that is transhistorical. The fact that it is an everlasting nature-imposed condition that man must work on the world. And in so doing, he works on himself. But through that transhistorical process of working on the world, we change who we are as human beings. This is what I mean by this kind of openness. So yes, there is a kind of underlying biology, obviously, but there's an underlying basis for language use, for the need to work on the world in order to subsist, because we're going to die otherwise. You can't, like, what's that story of that guy who went out into Alaska, and he was like, human beings are always trying to use stuff. I'm just going to go out
into the woods. I think it's the name.
Into the woods, yeah. And he learned very, very quickly this lesson, that is because we work on the world that we survive. And so it does. There is a dialectic between all of these sorts of things. It's not like we just appeared one day, but how people wind up taking it is like, oh, well, men have this problem with women because on the savanna grasslands, they start developing these just so stories that explain.
Yeah, we were our ancestors were more likely to survive because the men did pick up the laundry. Yeah.
I want to throw something up here from Spencer Leonard. Okay, go ahead.
I do want to just say, like just as a footnote, I have, like, I'm really like I really wish people would, like, I kind of hate that word transhistorical, because it's like, I think it sort of sounds like there's a substantive critique there when there's really not, right? Because you say, oh, would that be transhistorical? It's like, well, yeah, maybe some things are, some things aren't. You have to take it case by case, right? What's your sort of general metaphysical principle that absolutely nothing ever, like, doesn't vary between, like, different times in history or modes of production or whatever? Like, I think I think some things are allowed to be transhistorical, but I'm sorry, Doug.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to be very careful when we talk about things that are transhistorical. I mean, obviously there are scientific facts which we, to the degree to which we think they're true, we think they are transhistorical. But scientific theories are often revised. But if we believe that germ theory about disease is true, then that is making a transhistorical claim about disease, right? But then there's other political questions, like what's the best way for us to self-organize, and what are the assumptions that people have around what society should look like, and those things tend to be historical.
Well, those are very different. Those two questions that you just listed are very different questions from each other, right? Because so the first one you said is, what's the best way for society to be organized?
Right.
That's a normative question. Then the other one was, what do people think is the best something?
Well, no. What are the underlying assumptions that help them inform people about what society should look like?
Fine, but I mean, that's a question.
And I think both of those, I would claim, without arguing for it, that both of those, and I can't argue for it, but that both of those are historical facts. Kinds of assumptions.
The first one is a normative question. It's what should happen, right? And then the second one was the psychological question. It's like, what assumptions are people making, right? Those are two very different questions. And you can
have transhistorical accounts of both, is my point. You can have a transhistorical account of what should happen. You can say, well, we should align ourselves with nature, we should align ourselves with God, we should reach this ideal, which is transhistorical. And I'm saying we should be wary of those kinds of when we make that transhistorical move, especially around prescriptive projects that are political.
I think that you could. Maybe we're veering way off topic here, but I think that people often, I worry, conflate two different things. One of which is what you want to happen, and then the other is how much of that you could make happen given historical circumstances that are not of our own choosing. So in the critique of the Gotha program, when Marx is talking about the lower and higher phases of communist society, he uses there's this line that he has about how right could never be higher than the social conditions that give right to it, which is often sort of quoted as if it were a way of saying that it's all just sort of like what's even desirable is just sort of relative to a bunch of historically conditioned things. There's no transhistorical standard, but like the plain meaning of it is exactly the opposite of that, right? Because if you're saying right can't be higher than that, right, you're suggesting a scale of higher and lower, right? That's that you're going to be able to step outside of all of this and evaluate things based on, right? That even though the higher phase of communism isn't possible in society as it's just emerged from capitalism, it's still more desirable. It's higher.
Right. Yeah, it's a tricky move there that Marx makes. I do think that he. So I'll give you an example of the kind of normative aim that we might have, right? That I think is historical, and that at the same time I want to hold on to as being a part of the spectrum of our hierarchical progression, right? So, and so the question is, can I come up with an abstraction that would be historical, that this would be an instantiation, a particular instantiation of, maybe, but we have the aim of increasing our longevity and healthy lifespans for everybody. I think that is an historically determined or arrived on the scene historically. I don't believe that increasing the masses longevity has always been a social aim.
Can I just jump in with something that Spencer said in the comments? Spencer says, is the question of the best way for society to be organized a normative question? And I was about to say, no, it's a question that is thrown up by history. And then he answered. Sorry. One more down here. Or isn't a question of what tasks of mankind actually imposed upon themselves in history?
I mean, it is literally a normative question. We're asking what's best, right? That's a question about what, about value. You could say that the question has been thrown up by history, but I'm not sure how clarified that is. That's
because we're solving a problem, right? Like man never sets himself. The very fact that we're even having this discussion is because the possibility has become open to us.
Sure, so, totally. But that's a separate question, right? Like whether the possibility has become open to us of doing something, and whether that thing should be done, right? Whether it's a desirable goal. Are separate questions. I mean, that's that was the point of that example about communism, that Marx's claim there is that the more desirable thing is not historically open to you as you come right out of capitalism. So you have to do this somewhat less desirable thing first. They have this lower phase of communist society, and then when it comes open to you, you can progress. But I mean, all this talk of right being higher or or lower or higher phases or anything like that, only makes sense.
We could ask ourselves, how should we go about eliminating every man, woman, and child on Earth? And the conditions of possibility might be such that originally we could only do it very slowly with machetes over a long period of time, or that they could open up so that we could use nuclear weapons to wipe them all out. But the question would remain, the problem, of wiping out every man, woman, and child on the planet may not be a problem we want to solve, right? There's a normative component to the aim. But conditions of possibility change historically.
Yeah,
the way in
exactly.
Which we could solve that problem.
I think that the chat we just saw on the screen from Scott is making exactly the right distinction. That that the context of a question isn't the same as what kind of question it is.
Right.
That would be anyway.
But
the way that I phrased it last week was you can do a bunch of calculations to determine whether or not an asteroid is going to hit you. And yes, it is a normative question. It is normative to say I would prefer that the asteroid doesn't hit us.
Right.
The point, I guess the issue that I have is where people are like, oh, it's a normative thing. It's like, oh, well, if we don't solve this problem or come to realize what it is we're making in the world and become conscious of it and control it, then everything just carries on exactly as it is. No, it's like socialism or barbarism, right? It's we figure it out to figure out the catastrophe that we live in now.
I mean, even there, you could prefer barbarism. I mean, that is more or less, I guess, the anarcho-capitalist position, right? Take barbarism over socialism as your goal, but.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm sure there would be groups in society that were like, no, let the asteroid hit us. I'm sure, 100% sure.
Last week, Daniel Jacob, who's a friend of Sublation, mentioned and chided us and me, I think, particularly for forgetting my Kant. Kant had overcome the ought is distinction, according to Daniel. But
I don't think Kant would agree with that.
No, well, but what Kant, I think, did was demonstrate that there can be no normative standard without the conditions of possibility for that normative standard to arise. It doesn't mean that there's no distinction between the conditions of possibility and the normative standard, but rather that the one relies upon the other.
I would have, yeah. I mean, sure, ought implies can. That's fair enough, right? It's
right. That's what Kant would point to. That if you can't have a normative standard like we ought to hold our breath and continued to live for 1,000 years. That's not a normative standard that makes any
For a
sense.
normative standard to exist, it has to be possible.
Right. Yeah. That's
so, which is another way. I mean, Marx put that as, mankind does not challenge himself with a task that he doesn't already have the capacity to or a problem that he doesn't already have the capacity to overcome. That's Kantian in that sense. But I do think it's worth, again, going back to how much of the problems that are social are conceived of as being transhistorical or being and really they are so conditioned by what is that they can't actually be transhistorical. Like, for instance, the question of maximizing longevity that could only really arise once certain innovations in medicine and the creation of I think really could only arise after the creation of a working class, where we had people who had at least technically, legally equal value, in which case, increasing their longevity and the life in the abstract in itself was of value, and therefore increasing longevity of every person would be a valuable thing. It arose after hedonism, as an ethical system, or around the same time, maybe. I mean, I'm not an historian, and so I'm not making a claim about literal chronology here, but I just would say that understanding the way in which our normative aims are conditioned historically, and that also means materially.
If what you mean by conditioned historically is that you have to have certain historical circumstances in place for that to be, an aim that anybody would worry about, in either in the sense that, I guess in that example, part of it was that, the majority of the population, nobody would think that was a, worthwhile project, or maybe the slaves themselves would think that living longer was a worthwhile project, but nobody was asking them, or but certainly that it's historically conditioned in the sense that you need certain historical conditions to be in place for there to be enough of a possibility of achieving it to for it to be worth bothering with the question. If that's all you mean by historically conditioned, then yeah, I agree.
I mean, I think it goes a little bit beyond that. I think that the larger claim would be that to even conceive of the question requires the conditions of possibility. So
yeah, although that's going to be true for lots of, you gave the example of science earlier. There are lots of scientific claims that presumably we all agree have always been true, right? But it's only at certain very specific points in time that people could conceive of them.
Right. I guess the question is, to what degree are normative or political questions always historical and a matter of human understanding, as opposed to something outside of human understanding? And if you I can imagine that germs are in some fundamental way outside of human understanding, whereas what people altogether should aim at achieving and what is held up as the highest value might not be. I
would want to separate those questions, because you said whether it's historically determined.
I think those two things are connected, because if you hold something to be the highest value, what is considered to be the psychological preconditions, and that's going to inform what everyone should aim at. And we've already said, the material conditions or the historical conditions.
Well, there are historical conditions that, determine whether you can conceive of, lots of things. They have whether that's in some sense what makes it, right? That I think is a different question. And, and I don't think you have to say that there's metaphysically stuff, aims hanging from the sky or whatever. You could have a more grounded, view of it than that. But it's still not clear to me what sense it would be true that it's the thing itself being desirable as opposed to possible is a product of historical conditions.
So the philosophy professor and the philosophy undergrad have dived into the philosophical conversation.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.